Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 as we work through this series on biblical archaeology. In this video, we are going to be looking at archaeology from the days of David. A really exciting time, but also a very controversial time as far as archaeology goes. So having said that, let's get started. Most of us are familiar with the story of King David. However, it may surprise you to know there is not much mentioned of David outside of the Bible. In fact, for years, up until probably the early 90s even, many in the academic communities, many in the scholarly communities, didn't even think that David was a real historical figure. They thought that he was just a myth, someone created by the ancient Hebrews as a way to kind of compete with all their powerful neighbors, right? He's kind of like their version of King Arthur. And even though we have found evidence since then, some people still don't even want to believe that he was a real historical person. So we're going to take a look at that evidence now. This right here is the most important one. This is called the Tel Dan Stela. It was found in an area called Tel Dan, Mount Dan, and it was discovered in 1993. And what's on this broken tablet is really amazing. It details how the king of Aram, in about the mid-800, 850 or so BC, he defeated both the king of Israel and the king of Judah in battle, and he was proud about it. He was boastful. He was bragging about it. And you can actually read the story in 2 Kings 8:25 through 29. We know the king of Aram, his name is Hazael, and he's defeating the king of Israel, who is Joram, and the king of Judah, who is Azariah. Okay. Now, Azariah's name is not on the tablet because that part is broken off, but we know that it's Azariah because 2 Kings 8:25 lets us know. And so, in essence, what it is inscribed is his mention. He mentions Joram by name as the son of Ahab, the king of Israel. But when he comes to mentioning the king of Judah, Azariah, he doesn't just call him the king of Judah. He calls him the king of the house of David. Now, you can't have a house of David without David, okay? And it's also important to note how he refers to him. It's not just Judah, but the house of David. Hazael is bragging about beating one of David's descendants. He could care less which grandson it is. The fact is, he's connecting his name to David. David was the famous ancient king, giant killer, 120 years before the events that are being highlighted here in 2 Kings and in this stela. So it wasn't that long ago. It'd be like us looking back at events from the 1900s, right? It'd be like us thinking back to the time of not even to the Spanish-American War, of Teddy Roosevelt, you know. These were real events. No one here is going to say, oh, the Titanic, which is about the same amount of time separated. We all believe the Titanic was real. No one thinks of it as a myth. Hazael knew that David was a real person. He's a century and change removed from him, right? So he's bragging about it, right? David was great and mighty and powerful. He beat giants, and I beat his grandson. Therefore, by transference or whatever, David is great and I'm great, okay? This would be like you playing a basketball game against Michael Jordan's grandson, okay? And you beat Michael Jordan's grandson in a game of one-on-one. And you say, I'm great. I beat Jordan's grandson. His grandson could be utterly useless at basketball for all I know. Or maybe he's great. I have no idea. But it's about the name association, right? Jordan's great at basketball. I beat one of his grandkids. Therefore, I'm great at basketball. And that's what Hazael is trying to make this connection with, right? I beat one from the house of David. And so his boastful pride actually is acting as proof to show us that David was a real person. On top of that, now, speaking of David, let's talk about on the side of Goliath for a moment. Goliath comes from the city of Gath, and we've known where Gath is for a while, and they've been digging it up for a while. And just in 2015, just a few years ago, they found the gates. And these gates were huge. The leftover area, like the imprints from where the gates had been built, were huge. They were so big that they call them the Goliath gates because they're, big gates. Right? How original. Here you can see in this drone footage just the imprint that the gates left. And here you can see in this up close shot how just massive and heavy these gates were to leave such giant impressions in the ground. It's just crazy to think about. And all the buildings that were built there beside them, you can just see it's huge. Now, one of my favorite YouTube channels is that of a Messianic Jewish couple by the name of Sergei and Rhoda, and I just want to give them credit for this. This isn't archaeology necessarily related, but it is King David and Goliath related as far as it's experiential. So we know that in the Bible, in 1 Samuel 17, when David kills Goliath, that before that, Israel's on one hill and Philistines are on another hill, and there's a giant valley between them called the Valley of Elah. It's about a half a mile wide. Neither side obviously wanted to give up the high ground and the tactical advantage of running downhill, running a half a mile, and then running uphill. You'd be exhausted having to fight your enemy like that. So Goliath stood on his hill every day for 40 days, and he challenged the Israelites to single combat. He said, choose for yourself a man, and I will fight him. And he did this for 40 days, saying, if you win, we'll be your slaves. But if I win, the Israelites must serve us, said Goliath. So this couple went to the Valley of Elah just to see, hey, the Bible said Goliath was able to shout across the valley, obviously with no microphone or blowhorn or anything like that. So are the acoustics of the valleys as such that you could shout across the valley, even with 3,000 years of erosion, and still have your voice carry across the valley and be heard on the other side? And this is the result of their experiment.
Choose a man for yourself and let him come down and fight me.
That's pretty cool. I hear him. Look how he's much further now.
Choose for yourself a man. Let him come down and fight me! Choose for yourself a man!
Oh my goodness. Choose for yourself a man.
So there you go. I mean, that is awesome. Here's a guy, he's about 6 feet tall. He's about 3/4 of the way across the valley. You can see the hill on the other side with the trees behind him. And his voice carries the whole way. So it's like, if a 6-foot guy could do that, what could a 9-foot guy do? It's crazy to think about. So even with 3,000 years of erosion, you can still see the acoustics carry. And again, the Bible is accurate.
Choose a man.
Now, speaking of Goliath, the Bible tells us in that same chapter, he was covered in bronze. He had a bronze helmet. He had bronze armor, weighed 125 pounds. He wore bronze greaves. He had a bronze javelin. His spear was like that of a weaver's beam. It had an iron point. It weighed 15 pounds. And he had a shield bearer who also would have been carrying a bronze shield as well, right? Now, when we look at when we look at Philistine art, we can see how the Philistines are portraying themselves, right? They've got this headdress on, and it's not like the Roman, mohawk headdress, as it were, the red plume that they wore. This was like a 360, headdress that they wore, okay? Kind of, I guess, maybe not all that different than what some of the Native American tribes wore here in the United States back in the day. And you can see that even the Egyptians portray them with their headdress on. And even the Philistines portray themselves that way. And the armor that they wear, it's not very big. It's not very heavy. It's meant for speed more than protection, perhaps. So think about that. So by comparison, the description that we have of Goliath's armor in the Bible, it's clear, okay? This is not standard military issue by any stretch of the imagination, which, again, isn't surprising when you consider the dude is over 9 feet tall. In fact, his armor, as it's described, it's quite metropolitan. It's quite custom. I mean, it would have to be, right? Now, in around 1000 BC, most of the people who wore bronze helmets were the Greeks. And this is a Greek helmet from around that same time. As far as scale mail, like chain mail, made of bronze, typically that came from Egypt, and upper class Egypt. Only the pharaohs and the rich could afford to have all the individual pieces like this put together piece by piece to make a full chainmail set. You can imagine how big it had to be for Goliath, right? And just a quick side note about this. This is just a theological point more than an archaeological one. So I believe that the Hebrew word for bronze, at least the root word of it, is nahash or nahesh, however you pronounce it. And that's the same word that we see in Genesis 3 and elsewhere in the Bible for serpent, for snake. So here's Goliath, covered head to toe in bronze, covered in snake. He's got snake scales on, right? Think of, if you're reading this in the Hebrew, this just stands out to you. Here's this 9-foot guy covered in snake. Here comes David, who's the anointed one, the chosen one, the little M, Messiah. He comes with his slingshot, and he crushes the head of the guy dressed in snake. This is literally just shouting Genesis 3:15 about the seed of the woman crushing the head of the seed of the serpent. So here's David crushing the head of Goliath, who's covered in snake. So as far as the literary things that are being, showed in this chapter, it's really awesome. So back to the archaeology, though. Here are some bronze greaves that were from Greece, kind of give you an idea of what they may have looked like. And here is a Philistine shield, or what's left of it, made of bronze as well. Now, it's kind of neat that it mentions the fact that his spear was like that of a weaver's beam. Why this is called that is because what they would do on their spear shafts is they would tie a rope and they put their fingers in it so that when they threw it, it would have more thrust behind it. It would have more throwing power behind it, with that loop giving it just that extra oomph of power. Okay, and the way that the rope would just hang off the beam, it would look like a weaver's beam. The way that a weaver's beam, if you ever watched looming, which I suspect most of you have not, I know I haven't, but the way that the threads and the string would hang off the weaver's beam, it kind of got that nickname. Kind of similar to in World War II, when they would have the hand grenades that look, because of their shape, they called them pineapples because that's what they look like, right? So they called the grenades pineapples, the weaver's beam, the shaft. So military weapons named after common household objects, nothing unusual about that. So our final point that I want to bring up, and that is in 2019, they found the remains of a city where David had fled from Saul. If you remember, David faked insanity, and he fled to the Philistine territory. And eventually the king of Gath, Achish, gave David his own city called Ziklag. And we've never found Ziklag until just recently, okay? Just a few years ago, right before COVID. Here's some of the pottery that they've excavated from Ziklag so far. And you can see here from this drone shot that they haven't unearthed the entire area. They've only hid certain sections of it. So, the dig and the archaeology on Ziklag is still going strong, and it will continue obviously over the next few decades, and who knows what awesome treasures they'll find over the next few years. So we're going to stop right there for part 2. I hope you found this informative and useful, and just really interesting, these different archaeological finds that support the life of King David and the era in which he lived, and even those things that involve Goliath. So really cool stuff. I love archaeology, and I will see you in the next video for part 3.